Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel wherever you are in the world. I do hope you're doing well. I'm doing so much better. I've got to the end of my flu now, I'm glad to say, but I still have, I'm still, still getting stronger every day. You still feel a little bit weak after you've had the flu, but I'm getting better. So keep warm and make sure during this change of season that you have plenty of vitamin C and everything so that you don't get sick. And before we get started with our lovely story tonight, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, it was a searing hot day, as if the climate itself had held the people in the small, unassuming, rather charming rural town in Wyoming to ransom. The weather did not apologize for the wrath it had inflicted indiscriminately on the locals that lived here, as if it held a vengeful vendetta against the people and was waging war on its citizens. It was all that anyone could talk about, from the butchers to the bakers and the greengrocers, about how indomitably cruel the weather had been of late. Even at night the stranglehold of heat insisted on robbing the locals of a good night's sleep, and many people went to bed at night accompanied with wet towels and even ice packs, because getting to sleep when you felt like a lobster on a grill was not easy by any manner of means. Yet still the cruel weather aggressively persisted, with an unrelenting, dogged determination, as if like a marathon it had a race that needed to be completed. Many people claimed that they'd been able to fry eggs on the bonnets of their cars, as that was how extreme the weather had become, even up in the mountains when things should be significantly cooler. But it would seem the heat refused to show any mercy. If that was not bad enough, the fly problem had gone way out of hand, as the summer loomed steadily along, like a long ball of your grandmother's knitting wool, that you roll up that never seems to come to an end. The countryside had been dappled by the evidence of this dry heat, as if the scorched land had an insatiable thirst and was thirsty for the rains to fall, so that the repentant stone-washed countryside might at long last regain some of its lush green resplendence, which was being sadly lost under the formidable glare of this withering heat, as everything without exception, from the plants to the animals and people, were suffering badly. People around here were dreaming of cooler weather, as if it was something that seemed so beyond their reach, rather like an impossible goal you could never ever attain. It would seem many had short memories, that had quickly forgotten how brutal the previous long cold winter had been, always made more pronounced by the never-ending winds that Wyoming is well known for, that make you believe the weather is a whole lot colder than it actually is, as these seasonably cold winds can cruelly pierce through bone, marrow and sinew. Ranchers here in Wyoming were doing everything in their power to destroy these miniature buzzards of nature, these annoying pests we call flies, that seem so intent on making the livestock as miserable as possible. This was the western part of Wyoming, which gladly rejoices as it proudly leaves behind the more flatter grasslands and prairies, and magnanimously opens up like a glossy book into another world, or a micro-universe if you like. Many visitors to this part of the state have described it like that, as if they were visiting another country in America, when they come here, because it is so very different. Ostensibly for miles and miles dark roads snake out before you, surrounded by vast stretches of grassland and prairies that seem to go on forever and ever, as if there is no end or beginning in sight. The further west you go, the more spectacular the scenery becomes. Soon you are met by the rolling hills, the changing colours of moss and grass, vast expansive pine forests that stretch out like large splashes of green all over the countryside, that are quick to beguile the casual observer. Then there are the majestic contours of the Rocky Mountains themselves, that will command your utmost respect and wondrous awe, for these majestic, voluptuous mountains, masterpieces of nature, that artists so often come here to paint on canvas, rise and fall before you under a powder blue Wyoming sky, and you realize in the grand scheme of things how very small and inconspicuous you really are, as you observe herds of buffaloes and elk roaming the plains. The visitors that come here are stunned by the grand scale of the state and how big everything is here, and for the residents that have made Wyoming their forever home, when they leave the state to travel elsewhere or even go abroad, it's natural for them to feel claustrophobic, for they are used to being surrounded by an eternity of space. So booming cities and contained spaces can feel almost alien to them. Living in this western part of Wyoming has been described by many very aptly as being as free as an eagle, stretching out its powerful mighty wings as the bird navigates the skies. And for many people living here, it's not hard to have a love affair with the natural world, for the beguiling views that paint a colourful canvas over the countryside have enchanted so many, and not many can be accused of tiring of the prepossessing views that greet them every day when they rise from their sweet slumber. Alas, during this relentless, unmerciful heat wave, none of the locals were talking about Wyoming's beauty, for few were smiling, as the heat relentlessly pummelled them, as if they were in a boxing ring, having all the energy sucked out of them by a powerful opponent, so much more intimidating than they were. Let's not kid. Who can stand up to the fierce ferocity of a sun that has turned its temperature up to full blast, as the sun had done for the last 3 weeks or so? And it seemed like this insufferable sauna would never end, as if the man managing the beauty spa simply had forgotten to turn the thermostat right down. Clarissa's mother, known to the locals as Nancy Pearson, was holding her 8-year-old daughter's hand as they marched down the sidewalk together towards Beryl's ice cream parlour to buy ice cream, while the sun thrust its beams down on them so fiercely, with bright bursts of searing hot light. Both mother and daughter were wearing floral sundresses with cowboy boots on their feet as they sashayed down the sidewalk. Ostensibly, if you weren't wearing shoes, you'd lightly have fried the soles of your feet, as that was how fearsome the heat had become. Mrs. Pearson noticed that the beautiful flowers that were tumbling out of large keg barrels outside some of the local shops were looking miserably wilted and forlorn, as if they too were battling to cope with the searing temperatures. Outside every shop in town, people had generously placed out big bowls of water for the dogs to enjoy a cooling drink. Nancy Pearson believed everybody deserved ice cream in scorching, insufferable weather as formidable as this, and a long queue of like-minded people appeared to have gathered in line to buy ice cream outside Beryl's ice cream shop, for everybody had the same idea on their mind, and cooling off was the order of the day, for nothing beats ice cream to lift your disenfranchised spirit and fight off the heat. "Oh, hello there," said the young man standing behind the ice cream counter, whom 8-year-old Clarissa had never seen before. Maybe he'd been recruited by Beryl Bonnet for extra work during the summer, because Beryl's ice cream parlour had to be doing a booming trade in this heat, and was probably the only business in Wyoming thriving, as it was all Clarissa thought about when she woke up and went to bed at night, were bowls and bowls of creamy ice cream. Clarissa liked the look of the young man behind the counter, who wore a name tag on his customary pink and white striped apron, which read Ben Fuller. He must be new in town, she thought to herself. She'd never seen him before a day in her life. She rather liked his lopsided smile and cute dimples on both sides of his cheeks. Ben was gesturing to the vast display of deliciously creamy ice cream on offer, of which there were so many irresistibly tempting flavours to choose from. "What flavour would you like, ma'am?" the young man called Ben asked Clarissa's mother. "Would you like a cone or a cup? May I be so bold as to suggest a cup in this heat is a lot more manageable, unless you can eat a cone very quickly, because the ice cream melts so fast." "We'll both be having cups," said Clarissa's mother, very decisively. Clarissa's neat little nose was smudging the glass counter as she peered in at all the ice creams, with an expression of unbridled enthusiasm on her cherubic face. She was an adorable-looking child with ringlets of bouncy blonde hair and eyes so very blue, sometimes people wondered if they were actually real. Clarissa wore her heart on her sleeve and spoke so honestly about her opinions over everything But the only time her tongue was tied was when she was around her father Tristan, who was a travelling salesman, and when he was away things were so much better at home, the air always lighter, everything far more settled. But when Tristan Pearson arrived home, the atmosphere always became tense, and Mrs. Pearson would run around her husband like a butler attending to an earl, almost as if she was afraid of upsetting him. Tristan Pearson was a bear of a man, who was over 6 foot tall, with ponderously big shoulders, and if the truth be told, he never did pay much attention to his daughter Clarissa, almost as if he viewed her as rather annoying. He possessed those stereotype old-fashioned views towards children, and thought it was so much better that they were seen and not heard. Clarissa, like many other small child her age, longed for the approval of her father, but it was hard to come by, when he gave the family cat more attention than he ever did his own daughter. The cat could be quite nasty when he lashed out at you, if he was in a defiant mood, that is, and Clarissa's father seemed to be enchanted by the cat's stroppiness. Perhaps he saw himself in the cat, which was why he liked him so much. Clarissa adored ice cream. I mean, what right-thinking little girl like her did not? It was very hard to choose an ice cream flavour when they all looked so very good. She was beginning to salivate as she imagined the icy, creamy coolness of that ice cream on her tongue, soothingly sliding down her throat and cooling down her entire body. "What flavour do you want, Clarissa, love?" her mum asked her. "You can only have 3 scoops of ice cream, no more than that, because you might not eat your dinner tonight, and we can't have that, can we?" "I'll have 1 scoop of the strawberry, please, 1 of cookie dough, and I'll have the chocolate cherry," said Clarissa, watching the young man load up their cups with magnanimous scoops of creamy ice cream. Clarissa was secretly delighted that this man was so generous, when Mrs. Bonnet, who ran the ice cream parlour, with a smileless efficiency and a degree of insouciance towards her customers, was far too thrifty for Clarissa's liking, and more interested in lining her cash register with plenty of money than people's stomachs with ice cream. Let's just say when the hungry hopefuls gathered behind the ice cream counter at Beryl's ice cream parlour, the woman measured everything up so precisely, so you always walked away feeling rather hard done by, as if you'd been cheated. But this young man, who went by the name of Ben Fuller, seemed to have made the scoops of ice cream extra big today, and Clarissa was very appreciative about that, and she could not help but give the young man an extra big smile, by way of saying thank you. Ben gave Clarissa a big wink in response, as he handed Clarissa her big cup of ice cream, where all 3 flavours were piled up like a mountain of creaminess, waiting to be gobbled up. "What do you say to this very nice man, Clarissa?" "Thank you, Ben," said Clarissa. Clarissa's mother Nancy had chosen for herself 3 sophisticated grown-up flavours, 1 scoop of pistachio ice cream, 1 scoop tiramisu, and 1 scoop of decadent chocolate truffle. She pulled out some money from her tapestry purse and told the young man to keep the change. "I haven't seen you around here before," she inquired curiously, as when a stranger arrived in town, everyone was interested in learning about the new arrival, as they didn't get too many visitors to their small town, so new people were always a talking point. "That's because I'm not from these parts, ma'am. I'm from Nebraska, believe it or not. It's over 7 hours away from here, so it's not too large a stretch in terms of travel. I'm Mrs. Bonnet's nephew. She's my mother's older sister," Ben explained. "My aunt asked me to come up here for the summer, as with a heat like this, she's been run off her feet with the ice cream parlour. She says the hot weather has made her do a booming trade. Business has been great for her at the moment. She's getting orders even for home deliveries, so she begged my mother to rope me in to help her, as she can't manage on her own." "I bet your aunt is extremely grateful to have all your help," said Nancy, taking the ice cream cups from the nice young man. "I'm not surprised the business is booming." "You bet it's booming," said Ben. "I've been rushed off my feet, I have. Some people have been coming here twice a day for ice cream, and even my aunt says that's a first." "I can't say I'm remotely surprised about that," said Nancy. I would live in the ice cream parlour if I'd been given a choice. It's delightfully cool in here. But I guess my waistline would not thank me for it. I've got the kind of husband that notices if I even put on 2 inches. And he won't fail to mention it either. But do you know what? I don't care. So what if I put on a little weight? That's what I say. I'm going to enjoy all this ice cream, every single mouthful. The young man grinned. That's the spirit, ma'am. But by the looks of things, you're very slender. So if your husband's complaining about your waistline, I think he needs his eyes adjusting. Let's just say when my aunt first started the ice cream shop, she was a string bean, you know. She put on over £100 since she started up the business. And I know it's due to the copious amounts of ice cream she eats. But by right she should be the size of a beluga whale. She has to taste all the new flavours, you see. And every year she grows a little bigger. My uncle's not best pleased about it. And like your husband, he's not the type to keep his thoughts to himself. I'm afraid my uncle, well, he can be quite cutting and offensive with his rude remarks, if you know what I mean. Sometimes I feel quite sorry for my aunt. The other day he called her obese. My aunt refused to talk to him for 3 days, she was so upset. Well, I'm glad I don't have your aunt's job. And for the record, Beryl is not obese. You can tell her husband that from me. And yes, he is being rude calling her that. Personally, if I had to taste all the ice cream in the shop, I'd be rolling out of the door myself. So considering she stands around all these tempting trays of creamy ice cream every day, that you could only imagine eating, I think in the circumstances she's in excellent shape. Tell her to take no notice of that cruel husband of hers. Life is far too short to get strangled by the small stuff. That's what I always say. I will tell her you said that, said Ben. He handed Nancy her cup of ice cream. You've chosen well, if you don't mind my saying so. Pistachio is my absolute favourite. This one is an authentic Italian recipe. My aunt sneakily got from an ice cream parlour in Tuscany. She surreptitiously got the owner completely drunk, and then he divulged the secret to his age-old family recipe. Goodness gracious me! Your aunt is very shrewd. I don't think I'd have the balls to do a thing like that. Hats off to Beryl. Yes, what is it, love? Said Nancy, turning around to her daughter. What did you want to say, Clarissa? I just wanted to say, Ben, that you're much nicer than your aunt. Because your aunt is so mean. She only gives small scoops of ice cream, but you give big scoops, so you're very nice, Ben. Honestly, Clarissa, don't be rude to Ben about his aunt. It's not a very kind thing for you to say. But it's true, Mummy. Ben is really nice. He gives very big scoops of ice cream. Beryl is mean. She gives small scoops. Nancy Pearson looked apologetic as she smiled at Ben. I'm very sorry about my daughter's rude outburst, Ben. She didn't mean to be unkind about your aunt, I'm most sure. But you know what children are like. They say exactly what they think, without any filter. And I'm still getting used to it, and I'm her mother. My daughter never holds back anything, I have to say. Ben waved a hand in front of his face. Forget it. Everybody knows my aunt is as tight as an old boot, so I don't take offence at all. Enjoy your ice creams, ma'am, he said, giving Clarissa a wink. Armed with their ice creams, Clarissa and her mother happily trotted over towards a table in the far corner of the ice cream shop. It was covered with a red and white gingham tablecloth, like all the other tables. They chose a table where they could watch the passers-by on the street corner, as they tucked into their ice creams. Clarissa was glad, even at 8 years old, to get the weight off her small feet, and to be seated at a table where she could savour the ice cream and enjoy eating it as slowly as possible, so that it would last for as long as it possibly could. She had always learnt to eat things very slowly when you wanted to savour the taste. She was appreciating the coolness of the creamy deliciousness melting on her tongue and sliding down her throat like a fluffy cloud. There really was nothing better in this world than enjoying ice cream, and Clarissa liked the flavours she had chosen, but the strawberry flavour was the best, so she ate the pink scoop twice as slowly as the other two, to make it last for as long as possible. The ice cream parlour was abuzz with people all realising that taking the weight off their feet in this unrelentless heat wave was an excellent idea, so every single table was occupied. People looked as if they were beat up and tired. Bags hung haphazardly across chairs, and shopping bags sat sloppily on the floor with gaping mouths, as if their contents were close to spilling out. But no one seemed to care a jot about the withered state of their shopping. People looked genuinely fatigued. Most were wearing tank tops, denim shorts, and some were wearing cowboy hats and boots, while they eagerly tucked into their ice creams. Clarissa laughed as two dogs lay flat on the floor, absolutely exhausted and deflated by the heat. She pointed them out to her mother, who told her they looked exactly how she felt. Both dogs had been given a generous bowl of vanilla ice cream by Ben on the house. Clarissa was right about him. He was very nice. She wished he manned the ice cream parlour every single day, so that she and her mother could get huge scoops of ice cream. She knew only too well that Mrs. Bonnet would never dream of giving any visiting dogs free ice cream, and if she had any notion that her nephew was doing so liberally, she wouldn't be best pleased with him. Maybe she'd send him packing straight back to Nebraska, with his tail between his legs. The two dogs in the ice cream parlour Clarissa knew very well. She met them often enough on the sidewalk, when they were being walked by their respective owners. She'd often stopped to pat them, as Clarissa loved animals of every kind, and had begged her father for a golden retriever puppy, but her father had never committed himself to any promises. The black Labrador was called Araminta. He was owned by Blanche and Victor Reeson, a very nice couple in their early 60s. The other dog, an English bulldog, was called Max. He was owned by an old lady called Hope Tobias. Clarissa had no idea how old the woman was. Both dogs hungrily gobbled up their ice cream and looked up at Ben as if he was their new best friend. When Ben observed Clarissa looking up at him as he handed the dogs bowls of ice cream, he made an amusing gesture to Clarissa that suggested he was saying, "Don't tell my aunt about this." He then made that slit-throat gesture, and Clarissa giggled to herself. She knew he was saying to her, "If my Aunt Beryl knew about this, she would kill me. So this better be our secret." Clarissa nodded her head in agreement, and Ben gave her another wink. "Hello over there. Fancy catching the both of you together like this. What a delightful surprise," said Mrs. Clarence, her sing-song voice breaking through the tranquil silence, rather like a knife slicing through butter. She had appeared so abruptly from nowhere, with a bowl overflowing with ice cream. Clarissa counted she had 6 scoops, all in different flavours, in her cup. It really wasn't fair. Some people had all the luck. One day, when Clarissa was fully grown, she'd walk into an ice cream parlour and order ice cream in every single flavour, so much of it that she'd be able to float on her own ice cream cloud, like one of the white fluffy clouds in the Wyoming sky, and sail away on all that delicious creamy goodness, like a bird on the wind. She wished with all her heart her mother would let her have 6 scoops of ice cream, but that would never happen, not even on her birthday, which was 2 days away, as her mother did not like Clarissa to eat too much sugar. She said it might make Clarissa fat one day, and break out in all kinds of spots. Mrs. Clarence swooped down towards their table like a hungry vulture, descending on a meaty carcass. Nancy Pearson inwardly groaned as their neighbour approached the table. Bang goes the restful quietness of the day, she thought, as when Mrs. Clarence arrived on the scene, the talking would invariably start, and seemingly never stop. The woman had earned the reputation in town of being a bit of a gas bag, and in a dreadful heat like this, both Nancy Pearson and her daughter Clarissa didn't feel like talking very much. Nancy Clarissa's mother once described Mrs. Clarence as absolutely exhausting. "That woman can talk the ears off a dog," her mother had said. Clarissa did agree that Mrs. Clarence could talk a lot, but she didn't believe anyone could possibly talk the ears off a dog. She'd never heard of that happening before, and doubted it was a real condition, even though her mother seemed to think it was. Mrs. Clarence lived in the farmhouse next door to their farmhouse, but both farmhouses nestled on sizable properties of land, fringed by groves of tall lofty pine trees, backed by rolling hills, and the imposing silhouettes of the mountains that cast their distinguished signatures across the sky, that could never be forgotten or overlooked. "Oh, hello, Candace," said Nancy, looking up at Mrs. Clarence with a polite smile on her face. "Fancy seeing you here," she said, feigning surprise herself. But more often than not, on a trip to town, in weather like this, you could pretty much guarantee you'd find Mrs. Clarence hanging around the ice cream parlour, tucking into large volumes of ice cream. Even Beryl Bonnet, who owned the parlour, described Mrs. Clarence as her most prized customer. It was clear Mrs. Clarence loved ice cream, and simply couldn't get enough of it. Nancy had been quite astounded when she'd opened up Mrs. Clarence's freezer once, when looking after the family dogs for the couple, while they were out of town for a few days, and to her amazement she had counted over 200 tubs of ice cream in the freezer, which had taken her quite aback. How much ice cream did Mrs. Clarence actually eat, she had wondered. Mrs. Clarence owned 2 rotund dogs. They were both brother and sister. The female was called Esther, the male Domino. They were a cross between a Weimaraner and Rhodesian Ridgeback, and were extremely good-looking dogs, if they weren't so overweight. But they were also incredibly lazy, and liked to hang around Mrs. Clarence all day long, following her wherever she went. Mrs. Clarence was a soft touch when it came to her beloved dogs, so she lightly spoiled them rotten. And who knows, Clarissa thought, how much ice cream those dogs got through during the summer months. She thought if she were to come back in another lifetime as a dog, she'd choose to be Mrs. Clarence's dog, that was for sure. "You don't mind if I share a table with the both of you?" asked Mrs. Clarence. She made a beeline for one of the chairs at the table, which she pulled out from under the table. The chair made a loud screech, as it scratched rather loudly on the linoleum floor, but no one appeared to notice, as the buzz of people's happy chatter in the parlour drowned out the less friendly noise. Mrs. Clarence plumped herself down on her chair with an agreeable sigh of relief, as if getting the weight off her feet was as glorious as wallowing in a warm, scented bubble bath. "But of course you can sit here," said Nancy. "How have you been doing, Candace? I don't think I've seen you for quite a while. Actually, it's been a couple of weeks, has it not? It feels like an awfully long time." "How has anybody been doing, Nancy, I ask you?" said Candace. "I mean, we live in the mountains, for goodness sake. But we still haven't escaped this excruciatingly hot weather, have we? I can't do anything at the moment. The heat has absolutely drained me of all my energy. I mean, have you ever experienced heat like this? I ask you." "Oh, I agree wholeheartedly, Candace. Wyoming can get hot, but this is the worst I've known it. The other day I was actually wishing it was winter. That's a first for me, let me tell you," Nancy replied. For a moment even Mrs. Clarence appeared to be lost for words, as she tucked hungrily into the ice cream, and Clarissa watched her as she thrust oversized spoonfuls into her mouth. No wonder she'd ordered so many scoops of ice cream, Clarissa thought. I'm surprised she can taste any of it. She's eating it so fast. Ice cream is meant to be savoured, but Mrs. Clarence barreled through the ice cream at the speed of a rocket. She was not a slim woman by any manner of means, although she professed to have been on all the diets known to man, until one day Mrs. Clarence told everyone who would listen that she was never going on a diet ever again because it made life completely miserable, and Clarissa would agree with that. She had decided that if she ever grew to be as big and cuddly as Mrs. Clarence, she would never ever go on a diet. The thought of being deprived of the good things in life, most especially strawberry ice cream, was too deplorable to ever contemplate. She had seen her mother Nancy go on a diet once, when she'd eaten hard-boiled eggs for an entire week, and Clarissa had seen how miserable her mother had become. She'd also become incredibly snappy. And on the day her mother finished her diet, she baked a big chocolate cake for the family, but unfortunately gobbled down the whole thing because she was so hungry, and there were no crumbs even left for Clarissa to enjoy, which had been such a bummer. "Ah, I do feel so much better," said Mrs. Clarence, fumbling around in a purse to bring out a tissue, to pat the perspiration away from her brow. "Oh, I have got a bit of brain freeze, though. I do rather suspect I ate the ice cream a little fast. "Never mind. I've been sweating like a pig in this heat," she said. "This heat is such a killer. I heard on the news the other day 3 people died of heat stroke. Can you believe that? They've been warning people not to go out in the sun, at midday most especially. If you're old and frail, you really need to avoid the sun. But I'm afraid some people never listen, do they?" "Oh, I heard about that on the local news," said Nancy. "It's so dreadfully sad. But you do need to keep hydrated in weather like this, don't you? It can be very dangerous if you don't. I make certain I drink plenty of water in weather like this. Sometimes I even add some salt to the water. They do say that helps a lot." "Oh, do they? Well, I should try that then. Would you believe it, Nancy? My mother very nearly died of the heat the other day," said Mrs. Clarence, sounding aggrieved. "Honestly, that mother of mine, she is the absolute end. Who in their right mind goes into the scorching backyard at the hottest time of the day to plant tomato seedlings, I ask you? I mean, have you ever? I don't know who to feel more sorry for, my mother or the tomato seedlings that all died from the extreme heat, I hasten to say. If you're going to plant something, even I know that the hottest time of the day to lay down seedlings is probably not the best idea. But try telling that to my obstinately stubborn mother, who has a mind of her own, and if she wants to do something, even the devil can't stop her." "Goodness gracious me! Is that what she did?" asked Nancy, looking astounded. "Your mother is in her 70s, isn't she? She should be looking after herself better, especially in heat like this. What on earth is she doing planting seedlings in your yard in the scorching heat? Apart from anything else, that's asking for the seedlings to die. I have not got green fingers, but I know that." "Good question, Nancy. I'm afraid I wish I knew the answer to that question. But my mother is a law unto herself, as they say." "How do you know that your mother nearly died?" asked Clarissa, her blue eyes fixing on Mrs. Clarence with a curious intrigue. She found it rather hard to believe that something as innocent as the sun could kill you. But then again, it really had been very hot of late, and Clarissa had struggled to sleep at night. "Well, dear, my mother nearly dropped down dead in the heat of the midday sun," said Mrs. Clarence, shrugging her shoulders. "At least she had the good grace to admit that she went faint and rather dizzy and passed out. It's a long story, I'm afraid. I hasten to say, since then, she's never been right in the head. After she spent that time in the sun, I'm quite sure she got a touch of sunstroke or something. It can do funny things to your head, you know. She's been spouting all this nonsense ever since. Let's just say the things that are coming out of her mouth, well, they're absolutely ludicrous. My husband believes my mother's going senile. Personally, I think it's the sun that's affected her cognitive function, if you know what I mean. Of course, since the event, she's descended into a dreadful sulk, as no one is buying a single word of what she's saying. I think the heat has affected her brain. But don't tell her I told you that. She'll be mortified." "Well, what exactly happened to your mother?" asked Nancy, looking rather concerned. She'd liked Mrs. Clarence's mother. She was an eccentric old lady who dressed in bright, flashy colours and really rather overdid her makeup, so that her eyebrows and lipstick were highly exaggerated, and she wore far too much blush on her cheeks. But the woman always had a great sense of humour. "Well, I was taking a much-needed nap in the afternoon. I was completely exhausted. The heat wave completely sapped my energy. It wasn't doing me any good trying to get sleep at night, especially since my husband doesn't appreciate any air conditioning in our bedroom. He says it's not good for our health to sleep with it on all the time, but I disagree. Anyway, I went into the kitchen to rehydrate myself because I was desperately thirsty. I decided to look in on my mother to check she was all right and to see if she wanted a nice cold glass of iced tea. I got the shock of my life, you know, when I discovered my mother wasn't in our farmhouse. I'm sure you've noticed that she's a very feeble woman, not in the very best of health. She's on all manner of medications, but the less said about that, the better. Well, I practically lost it with my husband, didn't I, when I asked him where my mother was. My husband was reading a paper nonchalantly in the air-conditioned living room, would you believe? He doesn't mind sitting in a cool room, but refuses to sleep in one, if you can make any sense of that at all, because I certainly can't. He very casually said to me, "Oh, your mother is planting tomato seedlings in the yard." If it was the most normal thing to do in sizzling weather like this. I practically lost it with him, I'm afraid. I said to him, "You mean to say you have let my mother go out in the scorching hot sunshine to plant tomato seedlings at the worst possible time of the day? Are you absolutely insane, Rolf? Why the hell did you not stop her? You know planting any stuff in this heat is nonsensical. My mother's got a delicate constitution. It doesn't help that she burns easily with her fair skin." "Nothing wrong with planting a few tomatoes, love," my husband said innocently. I'm telling you, Nancy, I wanted to go up and strangle his neck, especially when he admitted that my poor mother had not even been wearing a hat. "Nothing wrong? Are you kidding me? You might be all nice and cool sitting here so lackadaisically in the living room," I said, "reading your paper, Rolf. But my mother is fragile. You let her go out in this weather. Haven't you heard the advice on the radio? It's been warning people to stay indoors during the hottest time of the day. They don't dish out this advice willy-nilly. 3 people have died in this heat wave, Rolf." "Oh, for goodness sake, love, keep your knickers on, will you? Stop being so damn dramatic. There's nothing wrong with keeping busy. It's good for your mother to be a bit industrious. You should be encouraging her, not sabotaging her good efforts to do something nice for us. We could do with some beds of tomatoes, and these are the Italian kind you use in pasta dishes. I don't care, Rolf, if these tomatoes grow in the Andes or the North Pole, but I do care about my mother, Rolf. What the hell were you thinking? I rely on you to watch her for me when I'm otherwise engaged. But I can see you haven't even given her a fleeting thought. Shame on you. Have you any idea how hot it is out there? I was out of the farmhouse as fast as a whippet, I have to tell you, Nancy. And what I did find, said Mrs. Clarence, opening her eyes up so wide that Clarissa thought she looked like the wise old owl she'd read about in her storybooks. What did you find? Asked Nancy. Oh, God, I think I know what you're going to say. Your poor mother had passed out from the sun. You found her lying in a crumpled heap. You thought she was dead. Is that what you found? Not exactly. Near enough, you could say, said Mrs. Clarence. In truth, I found no sign of my mother anywhere, but all the tomato seedlings she had planted were lying there on the ground outside the flower bed, roots all exposed, leaves wilted, and completely dead. They were beyond reviving. Goodness gracious, said Nancy, it must have been a scorcher. Where on earth was your mother? That's it. I couldn't find her anywhere. I began to panic. So there we are. That is the end of part 1 of our story. Part 2 is tomorrow night. I look forward to you joining me then. Until next time, goodbye and good night.